When a dog owner returns home from vacation, he's horrified to see blood on his walls. He looks at his German Shepherd and realizes the shocking truth. James stepped through his front door. The break had done him the world of good, but it was sure nice to be home now, and he couldn't wait to be reunited with his German Shepherd, Max. As soon as the door closed behind him, though, something didn't feel right. His home was silent. Max hadn't even come to greet him. He kicked off his shoes and began to call out to his dog as he checked every room. But when he got to the living room, he stopped in horror. All over the door and walls were blood spatters. He called Max more urgently, and this time the German Shepherd responded and came downstairs, but he wasn't his usual self. He was shaking and seemed scared. Cautiously, James nudged open the living room door with his foot and gasped. He looked at his German Shepherd and back into the room in front of him, realizing the shocking truth of what had happened. His friend hadn't been able to come over to take care of Max one evening, and this had happened. James had a simple but busy life, living in the small town of Ridgewood Park, Virginia. When he wasn't teaching history at a local college, he was enjoying the peace and quiet of his cozy cottage. It was a perfect escape from the world, especially for someone like James, who cherished his solitude after a busy day with his students. His constant companion was Max, a loyal German Shepherd who had been by his side for years. The lush greenery that surrounded their home was the perfect place for the big dog to run around and explore. To the professor, Max was more than just a pet. He was family. The man didn't have a wife or kids. It was just the way life had gone for him, but he was perfectly happy with that. He had all of his students to keep him feeling young and appreciated, and an abundance of friends who felt like family too. But Max was his most loyal companion. James had rescued him from a shelter when he was just a puppy, and the poor dog had been abandoned along with his siblings on the side of the road. Under James' care, though, Max became a loving, trusting dog who would do anything to protect his owner. Their bond had grown stronger over the years, and Max was always there to greet the professor with pure excitement whenever James returned from work. In turn, the dog brought joy and companionship to James' life. After a particularly difficult teaching year, James decided to use part of his summer break to take a much-needed vacation. He spent his evenings planning a trip to the mountains, the perfect location for both adventure and relaxation. However, he kept running into a problem. Every accommodation that he liked wouldn't allow dogs, and he wasn't sure how he felt about leaving Max behind. Over coffee with his friend Emily, he mentioned his plans in passing and was pleasantly surprised to find that she offered to take care of the dog. She told James he deserved a break and that she had no problem checking in on Max and taking him for a walk. She had known Max since the day James had brought him home and always made a big fuss over him when she saw him. Emily only lived a few blocks away from James, and he trusted her completely, so it was settled. James would take his vacation, and Emily would care for the German Shepherd. As James packed, he couldn't help feeling a twinge of guilt as Max watched him fill a bag with clothes and books. He gently patted Max's head and promised that he'd find them a little weekend break together when he got back. Taking Max with him now would have been ideal, but he desperately needed a break. He felt burnt out and couldn't pass up a week in a beautiful cabin surrounded by mountains where he could be out in nature and read his books. It would be the ultimate way to recharge. The plan for Max was in place, which put his mind somewhat at ease. Emily would visit the cottage, feed Max, and take him for his daily walks. Max loved Emily, so the professor felt reassured that his furry friend would be in good hands. In the mountains, James instantly felt at peace. All his troubles began to slowly ease, but he did miss Max. He was thankful to have a friend like Emily, though. She had been messaging him every day to let him know that his dog was fine. However, on his last day, Emily rang James, sounding upset. She was unable to make her usual visit that evening due to an unexpected emergency. She promised that she'd been to walk Max that morning and had left him plenty of food, but she wouldn't be able to make it in the evening. James assured her that the dog would be just fine that evening and that he was due back the following morning anyway. He told Emily not to worry about Max and to deal with whatever she had going on. After that, James didn't think much of it. After all, he'd be home soon, and he wanted to enjoy his final day. As James drove back to Ridgewood Park, he felt relaxed and calm after his break. He was excited to see Max, though, and already had a big walk planned after the German Shepherd had missed out the evening before. He figured he would check in on Emily during the walk, too, and make sure she was okay. He let his mind drift back to his days in the mountains as he drove along the familiar roads. It had really done him good to rest and reset. But as he pulled into the driveway of his cottage, he had no idea what was awaiting him. He imagined the German Shepherd waiting by the door to greet him, his tail wagging in excitement over their reunion. That couldn't have been further from the truth. When he opened his front door, he instantly knew something was off, as the dog didn't come to greet him. And when he reached his living room, he cried out in horror. All over the walls and door were blood spatters. Now Jane's mind began to race. Had his poor dog injured himself while he'd been left alone? Is that why he wasn't responding to his calls? James tried one last time to summon Max. He called out his name urgently and listened. A noise from upstairs alerted him to movement, and soon he heard the familiar thud of paws coming down the stairs. His relief at seeing Max was short-lived, though, as he quickly checked him over for injuries. The dog seemed to be fine, which meant there had to be another explanation for all the blood. But what could it be? It was a gruesome sight to come home to, and James wasn't sure he wanted to see what was behind the living room door. But he had to try and get to the bottom of what had happened. Something still didn't feel right in his cottage, almost like his home wasn't his anymore. Max wasn't his usual self either. He was practically glued to the professor and shaking all over. There was no sign of excitement over James being home, but the dog seemed relieved to have his owner back. James didn't want to touch the door in the state it was in, so he sharply tapped it with his foot and let it swing open. What greeted him made him gasp and stumble back in shock. His entire living room had been wrecked. Cabinets and drawers had been emptied. Sofa cushions were scattered all over the floor, and books had been haphazardly flung from their shelves. Now the pages were crumpled on the floor. James was shaking now, and he moved into the next room, careful not to brush up against the blood-stained walls. Max stuck closely by his side. It was the same thing in his home office. The whole room had been trashed. James stared at the room and the blood spatters, then glanced down at Max, who was whining now. He slowly started to realize the shocking truth. His home, his sanctuary away from the world, had been broken into. Given that Max didn't have any injuries, the blood could only have come from one place: the intruders. The German Shepherd must have loyally defended his home while the intruders attempted to do who knows what. James began to look around. He didn't notice anything valuable missing, much to his relief. The whole experience felt surreal, to think that someone had been inside his home. Max must have felt so scared and confused after the ordeal. The professor was shaken now, seeing what had happened. He could only imagine what Max had gone through with the intruders in the cottage. He was just glad that they hadn't hurt his loyal companion. Max had always been protective of their home and James, and it seemed his instincts had kicked in during the professor's absence. Given that nothing valuable had been stolen, it was likely that the intruders had been scared off by Max. Now that the man looked at all the blood on his walls, he began to wonder just how severe the injuries that Max had caused were. James felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude for his brave companion, but he began to wonder if that's how the police would see it. It dawned on him that his home was now a crime scene, and there were likely one or two intruders out there with injuries. James couldn't not call the police, but he just hoped they understood that Max was only defending his home. He reluctantly called the police and then slumped down on the floor, letting the phone slide out of his hand. The call handler had told him someone would be over promptly to take a statement and investigate the break-in. The shock of it all was catching up with him as Max gently nudged him. He placed an arm around the dog and let all of his emotions come out. He had gone on vacation to escape from all the strain he'd been feeling, but he'd come back to something far worse. Worse still, now there was a chance his dog would be in trouble for hurting someone when it was the intruders who were in the wrong. The cottage had always been a safe sanctuary, the place where he and Max were happy. but it didn't feel like his anymore. To think that someone had been through all of his things and trashed everything was one of the worst feelings he'd ever experienced. There was a soft knock on the door, and a familiar voice announced her arrival as she let herself in. Emily had come over to tell James that her family emergency was all sorted, and to ask about his vacation, but she got the shock of her life when she found her friend slumped on the floor, shaking and crying while the dog lay beside him. She rushed straight over and wrapped James in a hug while the man cried. It was only then that she noticed all the blood on his walls, and the color drained from her face. She leaned back and asked her friend if he or Max were injured. When he shook his head to indicate no, Emily gently asked what had happened. She listened in shock as James told her his home had been broken into. Max must have tried to defend himself. She couldn't believe it. The one night she hadn't been able to come over, this had happened. Was this all her fault? James was quick to reassure her that the break-in had nothing to do with her. The intruders would have likely still done it even if she'd taken Max on his evening walk. Worse, it could have happened while she was in the house, and who knows what would have happened? Their heart-to-heart was soon interrupted, though, by a loud knock on the door. It had to be the police. Emily gave her friend's hand a reassuring squeeze. She knew he was worried about Max, and she was too, although she hadn't let on to that fact. Surely the police would be able to see that the German Shepherd was only protecting his property, and they wouldn't be on the side of the intruders. Thankfully, James had nothing to worry about, as the officers praised Max for his actions and informed James that they would alert local hospitals to watch for any individual seeking treatment for dog bites. Hopefully, they'd be able to capture the intruders and take them in for questioning. The police began to gather evidence and look for fingerprints. Then they took a statement from James, although he wasn't able to give them much information. They also asked Emily if she'd seen anything suspicious during her visits with the dog, but she hadn't noticed anything either. All they could do now was wait and see if anyone showed up at a hospital. With the police gone, James looked around at the dire state of his home, but he couldn't even bring himself to tidy up. He didn't want to be in his cottage right now, and being the good friend that she was, Emily could sense his discomfort. She told James that she wasn't taking no for an answer, and that he and Max had to move in with her for a while. As the professor gathered some clean clothes, Emily began to load Max's food, his bed, and a few toys into her car. It was the least she could do for them. It was clear James was very shaken by the whole thing, and Max seemed affected too. Emily was more than happy to have them living with her until they felt like they could return to the cottage. Over the next few days, James tried to get himself back into some sort of routine. Being at Emily's was definitely helping, and it was nice to have someone else around. Little did he know that Emily had also been making sure the cottage was ready for his return, whenever that may be. She'd spent countless hours cleaning the whole place, tidying up, repairing or replacing broken items, and finally scrubbing and repainting the walls. When she'd finished, the cottage was back to its usual cozy look, with no trace of any intrusion. She had also been researching security systems and had passed some information over to James, encouraging him to take action to make the cottage safer. As weeks passed, life slowly began to return to normal. The police were still on the lookout for the intruders, but there had been no new developments. Given the amount of blood he'd seen on his walls, James was shocked that no one had gone to the hospital with bite injuries. He could only assume that the intruders had figured they'd probably get caught. James decided to follow Emily's advice and install a security system in his home to prevent future break-ins. He also made sure to take Max on longer walks, allowing him to release any pent-up energy and continue their training sessions to keep him engaged and let him know that he wasn't at fault. The first time he stepped foot inside his cottage again, he was shocked to see what Emily had done. He had no idea that she'd been around and tidied the whole place up, but he was surprised to find that she'd also added in some cozy extras for his return. New cushions lined the sofa, and the log burner had a fresh pile of logs waiting next to it. He smiled. Emily had been a real angel throughout all of this. He had no idea how he would thank her. He found that the pair had gotten even closer since the break-in, and although he was getting ready to return to his cottage, he now felt like he would miss Emily when he left. On the first evening back in his cottage, James sat by the fireplace with Max at his feet and reflected on the events of the past few months. He felt grateful for the support of Emily and the bravery of Max. The break-in had been a frightening experience, but it had also brought about positive changes in his life and got him thinking about a few things. Emily had always been a close friend, but their relationship had changed now, and he'd been thinking about doing something for quite a while. He picked up his phone and messaged Emily, asking if she'd like to go out to dinner on Friday. He felt like it was a risky move that could potentially ruin their friendship, but he was developing feelings for her, and the break-in had taught him that life was too short to have regrets. His phone buzzed immediately, and when he looked at the response, he felt his heart soar. Emily replied that she would love to go for dinner. Maybe this was the start of more than just a friendship. Max began to wag his tail as if he could sense his friend's happiness. The break-in was one of the worst things James and Max had ever been through, but everything had worked out in the end. James had made his peace with the fact that the police were unlikely to find the intruders now and had decided to just get on with his life, a decision which, judging by Emily's response, was working out well so far. Now it's over to you. What do you think of this story? Do you know any stories of animals defending their homes? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.